Did you know that Napoleon once faced an army of rabbits? What happened when he tried to conquer them? You're probably thinking, Napoleon, the famous French emperor who conquered most of Europe, right? That's right. But before we dive into the absurdity of Napoleon versus bunnies, let me give you a brief rundown of who Napoleon was. He was a brilliant military strategist, a skilled politician, and one of the most influential leaders in history. He rose to power during the French Revolution and became Emperor of France, ruling for over a decade. But, despite his impressive resume, even Napoleon wasn't immune to a little embarrassment, and that's where our rabbit story comes in. You might be wondering, what's the deal with Napoleon and rabbits? Well, it's not every day you hear about one of history's greatest leaders being chased by a bunch of fluffy bunnies, is it? Yet, it's a surprisingly fascinating tale that reveals a more human side to Napoleon's character. So, sit back, relax, and let me regale you with the tale of Napoleon versus the rabbits. So, let's set the scene. It's the early 19th century, and Napoleon is at the height of his power. He's already conquered much of Europe, and his military campaigns have made him a legend in his own time. But, like any self-respecting leader, he needs a break from conquering the world, right? That's where the rabbit hunt comes in. Napoleon, being the outdoorsy type, decides to organize a grand hunting expedition in the French countryside. Sounds like a lovely day out, doesn't it? Well, it wasn't exactly what Napoleon had in mind. The event in question took place in 1807, when Napoleon was still basking in the glory of his military victories. He invited a bunch of high-ranking officials and nobles to join him on a grand hunting spree. The goal was to catch some rabbits, have a good time, and maybe even impress his guests with his hunting prowess. But things didn't quite go according to plan. As Napoleon and his entourage arrived at the hunting grounds, they were greeted by an unexpected sight: hundreds of rabbits, all hopping around and seemingly eager to get in on the action. Now, you might think, what's the big deal? It's just a bunch of rabbits, right? Well, these weren't just any rabbits, they were fierce, fast, and determined to outsmart the great Napoleon. The hunt began, and Napoleon, being the confident leader he was, charged into the fray, guns blazing. Or, at least, he tried to. The rabbits, however, had other plans. They started to swarm around Napoleon, nipping at his heels, and generally causing chaos. The emperor, taken aback by the sheer number of rabbits, began to lose his cool. Imagine the scene. Napoleon, the great conqueror of Europe, being chased by a horde of fluffy bunnies. It's a sight that's both absurd and hilarious. The more Napoleon tried to shoo the rabbits away, the more they seemed to multiply. His dignity began to suffer, and his guests started to giggle at the spectacle. As the situation spiraled out of control, Napoleon's patience wore thin. He started to shout orders at his soldiers, trying to get them to round up the rabbits and restore order to the hunting grounds. But it was no use. The rabbits were too quick, too agile, and too determined to outmaneuver the imperial forces. The weeks leading up to the rabbit hunt were a tumultuous time for Napoleon. He was dealing with the aftermath of his disastrous campaign in Spain, and his relationship with his wife, Josephine, was on the rocks. Maybe that's why the rabbit hunt seemed like such a great idea at the time. A chance to get away from the pressures of ruling an empire and just have some fun. Little did he know, the rabbits had other plans. The build-up to the rabbit hunt was a gradual process. Napoleon had been feeling restless, trapped in his palace, and in need of a break from the constant politicking and strategizing. He was also keen to show off his skills to his guests, to prove that he was still the mighty warrior they all admired. So, he decided to organize the grandest hunting expedition the world had ever seen, or, at least, that was the plan. As the days went by, the anticipation grew. Napoleon's guests arrived, and the atmosphere was electric. Everyone was excited to see the great emperor in action, to witness his hunting prowess up close. But, as we now know, the rabbits had other plans. The morning of the hunt, Napoleon rose early, dressed in his finest attire, and set off to conquer the rabbits. He was confident, brash, and ready to take on the world, or, at least, the rabbit world. But, as we've seen, things didn't quite go according to plan. The moment when Napoleon realized he was being outnumbered and outsmarted by the rabbits is a turning point in this bizarre story. It's the moment when the mighty emperor's facade began to crumble, and his guests started to snicker behind his back. Imagine the look on his face, the mix of shock, anger, and embarrassment. It's a sight that's both hilarious and poignant. As Napoleon tried to regain control of the situation, the rabbits continued to wreak havoc. They darted under his feet, stealing his spotlight and making him look like a fool. It was a moment of pure chaos, a moment that will forever be etched in the annals of history as the time Napoleon got outsmarted by a bunch of bunnies. In the end, Napoleon slunk away, defeated, his dignity bruised, and his pride wounded. It was a rare moment of vulnerability for the great emperor, a moment that humanized him in a way that few other events in his life could. So, what did Napoleon learn from his encounter with the rabbits? Perhaps it was the importance of humility, the realization that even the greatest leaders can be brought low by something as simple as a bunch of fluffy bunnies. In a strange way, the rabbit hunt says a lot about Napoleon's character. It shows us a more human side to the great emperor, a side that's vulnerable, fallible, and, dare I say it, relatable. So, the next time you think of Napoleon, don't just think of the conqueror of Europe. Think of the guy who got outsmarted by a bunch of rabbits. So, what do you think? Did Napoleon's encounter with the rabbits change your perception of him? Let me know in the comments below. And, if you're interested in more bizarre historical anecdotes, be sure to check out our video on the most ridiculous wars in history.